Canon's Sumire cinema primes are a completely new optical design for Canon, with a very different style from their other modern cinema lenses, which was actually heavily inspired by their older K35 cinema lenses. Now, I've talked about these in detail in our recent video on modern cinema lenses with a vintage aesthetic, so if you haven't watched that video, make sure you go give it a look in the link in the description. But as part of that video, we did a bunch of lens tests on each range of lenses we have here, which we wanted to show you in more detail, so that's what this video is. And that video was made in this wider 2.35:1 aspect ratio because we were featuring anamorphic lenses, and we're actually filming this on an anamorphic lens as well. So that's why this video and these tests are all framed for 2.35:1, even though these are of course spherical lenses. The Sumires come in a 14, 20, 24, 35, 50, 85 and 135. Although we only had the 24, 35 and 50mm for this video, so we could only test those ones here. Unfortunately, we couldn't get access to the full set in time. The maximum apertures also vary more than some other cinema primes, which is possibly my least favourite aspect of these lenses, to be honest. The 14 is a T3.1 and the 135 is a T2.2. Then the 20, 24 and 35 are T1.5, while the 50 and 85 are T1.3. So it's not that inconsistent. You can treat that central range of lenses like their T1.5, while knowing that the 50 and the 85 can go that little bit further if needed. So it's certainly not the end of the world, but I would have just preferred them to all match a little bit better ideally. But of course these lenses are all about how they look and their character. So let's look at some tests. The Sumires have one of the most unique looks of any cinema lens I've tested so far for ProAV. For a modern lens, these have a lot of character to them. And this is character you'd normally only see in older, vintage lenses. But before I get onto that, it's important to remember that these are still high-quality modern lenses. The physical construction is fantastic, but there is also minimal distortion, vignetting, or chromatic aberration. Flaring is also extremely under control. There is a flare there, some slight ghosting around the lens source and a few subtle mirrored orbs as well, but they're minimal and don't draw too much attention. One area I would like to talk about though is sharpness, because these, well, they're not soft lenses in the big scheme of things, but compared to other modern lenses like Canon C&E primes or this Sigma Cinema prime here, they're definitely not as detailed. This to me is the main drawback of the Sumires. If you want that high resolution detailed look, these probably aren't the right lenses for you. But it's also a strength. If you combine this slight softness with all of the optical character, you actually end up with a lens that is very good at taking the harshness off of a high resolution modern cinema camera. If you're the type of DOP who actually wants to back off the sharpness of your camera a little bit and give the images some character back, then this could actually be a big advantage for you. Breathing is also very under control. There is some, it's not completely gone, but it is minimal. So let's talk about that character that I keep mentioning. The out of focus rendition from the Sumires is unlike anything I've tested before. The bokeh has this swirly effect, which you see on quite a few vintage lenses. It goes from round in the very middle to a slightly squashed rugby ball shape towards the edges in a circular pattern. As it becomes more squashed, the shape does stay very natural looking though, which is nice, because some lenses can look a bit artificial sometimes when they do this. But the characteristic that I find the most fascinating is that the amount of background blur seems to change as you near the center of the frame. If we look back at our Sigma lens, the wall and lights behind George's head and shoulders has exactly the same amount of blur as the edges. And this is what lenses normally look like, of course. Swap back to the Sumires and you can see what I'm talking about. The wall seems dramatically more blurred behind George than it does at the edges. It's almost like the center of the image is at a wider aperture than the edges. In fact, if we put them side by side, the middle is significantly more blurred on the Sumires than it is on the Sigmas. So if the amount of background blur is important to you, the Sumires will kind of feel shallower than they actually are at any particular aperture, because they're going to throw that central bit of the image out a little bit more than other lenses. And what I like about this effect is that it feels like a very shallow focus shot where the subject really stands out, but we still get some perspective on the background. We can see the lamp and the plant on either side of George and make out that it is a brick wall that he's in front of, not just some blurred shape, because we get that information from the edges. This is particularly notable in this setup at the wider focal lengths. As we go between the 24mm Sumire and the 24mm Sigma Classic, you can see that the edges have a similar amount of blur on both, while the middle has much more blur on the Sumire. So George stands out as a result from the background much more. It's a very interesting effect and one I really like. It's only there wide open though. If we stop down to T4, the effect is almost entirely gone and the lens looks much more normal. So if you don't want this look for some shots, that's okay, just stop down a little bit and you're all good. Let me know what you think of these tests and the way that the Sumires look in the comment section down below. And of course, if you want to buy some for yourself, just get in touch with the ProAV sales team, who'd be happy to help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.